So we find ourselves at the Emancipation Proclamation. Some of you might know what it is. I kind of alluded to it the other day. We're going to talk a little bit about it. Huge part of the Civil War, but a lot of people have some misconceptions about the actual proclamation. We will hopefully extinguish those today. As you guys know, the Civil War was not about slavery. The reason the South left was states' rights. They believed that they should have the right to decide whether they wanted slavery or not. It was just that slavery was what they wanted to decide. And Lincoln, his idea was, you know what, slavery should not expand, but where it is right now, that's fine. Mainly because he didn't want to rock the boat. He didn't want to make anyone angry. So, you know, the purpose of the Civil War is to bring the South back to the Union. That was the main purpose at the start of the war. But as people start dying by the tens of thousands, you know, we talked about Antietam, where combined the Confederacy and Union had over 23,000 casualties. People in the North start wondering, what is this war really about? We understand it's about bringing the South back, but at what cost? I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of young men and men who are gone. And for a long time, Lincoln kind of sidestepped the issue because if you remember, there was 4 states that had slaves that had not left the Union, those border states. And he was worried that if he, you know, let the slaves free, that those states would say, oh, you're going to do that? All right, we're going to join the Confederacy. And that would have not been good. Those states had a lot of industry. Those states had a lot of railroad miles. We talked, those are 2 advantages the North had over the South. So he really watched what he did. But there's going to be a time where it's going to be necessary. So by mid-1862, the Union's not exactly doing well on the battlefield. And Lincoln starts to wonder himself, you know, how can I change this? What can I do? In the North, there was already some African-American regiments, and they were some of the better fighting ones. The problem was, though, that they weren't really allowed to fight too much. They were looked upon as inferior soldiers, but that was not the case. So Lincoln starts throwing around the idea of freeing the slaves. He comes to the conclusion that he's going to free the slaves, but he's only going to free the slaves in the Confederacy. So those slaves that are in those border states that are still part of the Union, they're not free. He did that so that he would not make those border states mad. But all the slaves in the Confederacy were now free. But it's not like these slaves got up and left. Obviously, the Confederates and the slave owners are going to keep these slaves from A, finding out, and B, leaving. And there's a few reasons Lincoln frees them. There was over 3 million slaves in the South that were used as laborers. They were not fighting because, remember, these slaves are still property. They don't want to lose their investment. So they're used as laborers for the war effort. So Lincoln said, hey, if I can get some of these African Americans in the South out of there and not laboring for the South, it's going to help us. Most were laborers. There were some cooks. There were some nurses. But most of them were laborers. So once again, though, the only slaves that will be free are the ones that are in the Confederate States of America. Lincoln had always kind of wanted to free the slaves, but like I said, he didn't want to make the border states angry, and he didn't want to upset the Union. But once there's a civil war, the South's already kind of mad. What can you really do? And Lincoln also didn't want this to look desperate when he freed the slaves, it was a last chance. So he waited for a big Union victory. That Union victory was Antietam. We talked about that the other day. It wasn't really a victory for the North. It was more the fact that they stopped the invasion of the South. So he waited for a victory. He didn't want to look desperate. So Lincoln announces the proclamation about 5 days after the Battle of Antietam on September 22nd, 1862. It does not become formal until January 1st, 1863. No slaves were actually freed, because remember, technically, from the view of the South, there are not two countries. So the way the South saw it was, well, that's not our country. That's a different country saying people are free. It would be as if Mexico said, passed some laws and expected us Americans to follow it. We wouldn't do it. We would say, you're Mexico, we're the United States. That's how the Confederacy saw it. But to the North, or to the Union still, the South was still part of the United States, and this law was for real. But like I said, a lot of slaves didn't hear about it, and the South did that on purpose. They kept it a secret, and even if they did, they still had to escape. It wasn't like the Southerners were going to say, oh, yep, that's the way it is. You're free to go now. So really, it didn't do much, but it was just that idea that, this war has become about a little bit more about bringing the Union back, but also freeing the slaves. Lastly, if you remember, the South was hoping to get help from Europe. Well, this kind of ended that with the freeing of the slaves. Most of Europe didn't have slaves, so when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, most of Europe kind of sides with the North. They say, well, even though they didn't have slaves to begin with for the most part, we agree with more what they're doing than the South. So it hurts the South, not immediately, but it's a good start. You got to realize too, like once the Union troops would come around southern states, slaves would absolutely flock to these troops because they thought, oh, we're free now. But what the Union would do a lot of the time is they would hold these slaves until the slave masters would come and pick them up. So a lot of people think these people just walked out of the South once the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. Didn't really happen because the South didn't see it as a real law they had to follow because they were their own country. Shortly after the Civil War starts, African Americans are actually allowed to join the armed forces for the Union in the North. Right away, though, they're not allowed in combat. They're used mainly for non-combat duties, guarding things, guarding towns once they'd already been captured, stuff that really, if you're a soldier, you really don't want to do. It's kind of boring stuff. They fought in all-black units, but were commanded by white officers. So early on, they don't really do much, and you can imagine the discrimination that they had, and there's a lot of discrimination. But not only the discrimination we think of, but other things like not being allowed to really fight because they were black, and not being paid the full wage simply because they were black. But starting in 1863, they're allowed more of a role in the fighting, mainly because people start realizing, especially Ulysses S. Grant, who eventually become the head of the Union Army, and he realizes, and these guys can fight. We got to get them, in battle more. And he realizes that from an early stage, and the next year they're finally allowed equal pay. So they're a huge, huge, huge asset to the North. But usually, if they were captured by the Confederacy, usually they were killed right away, because you can imagine how the South felt about African Americans fighting against them. They didn't think it was cool or great or anything like that. So they were targeted. And if you were a white officer in charge of a black regiment, you would receive the same fate too. And we'll actually watch a movie about the most famous regiment here I'm going to talk about. So altogether in the Civil War, about 200,000 African Americans fight. And your book and history books in general really don't talk about, they always talk about African Americans in World War I, World War II, even the American Revolution. But the Civil War, they kind of just exclude. And what a lot of people don't realize is, for the amount of African Americans in the North they played a huge role. I'm just going to give you one fact. During the Civil War, African Americans made up 25% of the Navy. Now you're saying, Mr. Pope, that's only 1/4. But compared to how many whites there was, they were overrepresented. And I think in the Army it was something like 10 or 15% they made up. They were overrepresented. So they played a huge role. So not only did 200,000 fight, 40,000 die because of that. The most famous known group of African Americans that fought for the Union was the 54th of Massachusetts. Now, these men were not from Massachusetts. They were from all over the North. And a lot of these guys were recruited by Frederick Douglass to actually join this regiment. And we're going to watch a movie called Glory at the end of the unit, and it's all about this regiment. They're not allowed to fight, and finally they're allowed to, and they lead this kind of suicide attack on Fort Wagner where half the men and even their commander and officer are killed, but they gain the respect of not only the white soldiers, but the nation as a whole. People start realizing, these are people too, and they're fighting for their own causes. Really good stuff. We'll watch the movie on it. So even though the Emancipation freed the slaves in the South, like I said, a lot of them didn't know about it, or a lot of them, weren't allowed to escape. The ones that knew about it, they simply slowed down their work. They knew, hopefully, they hoped that the Union would come close and, free them. So a lot of them slowed. An amazing stat is by the end of the Civil War, 1/4 of the slaves in the South will escape, will free themselves. That's a huge number. There was about 3 million slaves. So about 750,000 slaves free themselves. A lot of the ones that free themselves, they join the Union Army. Some become spies because they know the land well. Some become soldiers, and they play a huge role, but a lot of history books kind of undermine their role. But huge role. And when we watch the movie, you'll see a little bit more. There's discrimination they faced, obviously in the North, but even in the South, they were targets for Confederate soldiers.